Hello and welcome to Control Delete Tutorials. My name is Jason, and today we're going to talk about getting triggered in Unity. And what I mean by that is I'm going to go over how we can create some triggers and how we can use C# to script different things to kind of happen with this. I'm kind of treat this as a kind of beginner's lesson. So we'll get started here. So we have Unity over here. Now I'm using Unity 5.3.3. What I am doing should currently work in any newer versions of Unity, and it should also work in most of the older versions, as long as you're not too far behind. All right, so I'm going to start off by just creating a new project, and I'm going to name my project Get Triggered, and go ahead and save our project here. So I'm just going to make a new folder, new. And we'll just give that the same name, Get Triggered. There we go. And we'll select that folder. And I want this to be a 3D project. And I'm going to add in the characters package into Unity. That way I can have a first-person character controller. So that way we can talk about tagging objects as well. So we'll do create project, and we'll just let this load up. Okay, so we have Unity open here now, and I'm going to go down to my project window, and I'm going to go ahead and just close my animation tab here. That was from another video where we talked about animation, so we can go ahead and get rid of animation and animator. Don't need those. So with any object we create in Unity, let's say if we look at our main camera, we can see that our main camera over here has a tag called main camera. Now you only want to have one object tagged as main camera in your scene, or else you can have some scripts create some kind of problemsome things happening. So we're going to talk about tags a little bit and kind of what else we can do with those. All right, so I have the standard assets here. These are brought in anytime we import a Unity package, and I have the characters. So I'm going to go ahead and take characters and open up first person. I'm going to go to my prefabricated objects, my prefabs, and I'm just going to drop in my first person character controller. Okay, so we're going to see that pops in, and I like to have my objects start out, so I'm just going to reset so these all start out at 0, 0, and 0. And then I'm going to tag this object. So currently it is untagged. So what I like to do is, this is going to be my player character, so I'm going to tag it as player. If I wanted to create a custom tag, I can go to add tag, which is going to open up the tags and layers menu here. And I can open this up and I create a tag and call it whatever I want. So I could call this, enemy. And any enemies that I have in my game, I could tag as enemy. And if we drop down here, we can see that enemy has been added to the tag list. So I'm just going to keep that as player for now. And I'm going to bring in a 3D object just so we have something for this guy to walk around on. So I'm just going to use a plane, and I'm going to set that plane to be pretty big. So we'll do 10 by 10 by 10, and that should be big enough. And our character is 1.8, that would basically be meters tall. And so what I'm going to do is, my guy's currently down in the ground here. So in the Y position, I'm just going to move him up a little bit. We'll go, that's going to be too much. So we'll just do 0.9. So I'm doing half the distance of his height. So that should put him right on the ground when he starts out. And I can go ahead and hit play and test that out. Just make sure that I am indeed able to land on the ground and walk around. Okay, so I'll hit escape just so I can get my arrow key to cursor to show back up. Okay, so I have my first person controller. I also have this plane. You know what? Just to show more tags, we'll go to add tag. And I could call this ground. And there we go. And I'll go back to my plane in the inspector. And I'll drop that down. That'll be our ground object. So I like to keep pretty organized here. Anything that's in the standard assets, I normally leave that folder alone since those are kind of Unity default things. So I'm going to right click and create a new folder. And I'll call this scripts. And this is where I'll be able to create my different scripts. I'm also going to make my own prefab folder. So I'll do folder, prefabs, and we'll use that if there's an object that we need to bring here again. So something else I'm going to do is create another folder for materials, just because I don't want everything to be this boring white. Materials, and I'm going to open that up. Oh, sorry, I created a new material. That's my mistake. Create new folder. I was thinking materials, so I clicked on materials. Materials, and I'll just go ahead and drag this one in here. Now, one of the things I talk about a lot with Unity is I like that Unity has these folders, and these folders are live. So that means that anything that I create here is going to pop up in here. So in my get triggered folder, it's going to have my all my folders here, and any assets I create will also be in there. So I really like that about Unity. Makes it really easy to develop things and kind of organize things. So I'm going to call this texture my material. So I'm just going to say mat_ground. And I'll just make this like a kind of a gray brown color. And I'll apply that to my ground. I'm going to make another one that I'm just going to name trigger. Now you don't have to have this in order for the trigger to work. This is just so I can get the trigger to show up in the viewport. So I'll just call that trigger. And let's stick to our naming conventions. And I'll take my trigger. I'm just going to make this green. And instead of this being opaque, I'm going to make it semi-transparent. So I'll set transparent there. And then if I change the alpha color here, I can make it transparent. So we'll do that. All right, let's create a sphere object. And this sphere is going to be our trigger object. So I have my sphere there. It starts out at 0, 0, 0. So happy about that. And I can just take my matte material and just place that on there. If I hit F, I can kind of zoom in here. And let's make this material just glow a little bit. So I'll go to emission. And I'll just have my emission here be a little bit of a kind of another green color. Okay. So that's going to be my trigger object. Let's go a little more transparent just so we can definitely see through that really well. Well, since I have my emission on, it's kind of overriding that, so that's okay. So I'm going to take my sphere. I'm just going to go ahead and name this trigger object. So we have some components under here. We're always going to have this transform. This just allows us to position it in our game. We have the mesh filter, which renders our mesh to the camera. We have our sphere collider, and you can see here we have a setting called isTrigger, and it's currently not turned on. So if I take this object, and I'm just going to move it up in the viewport here a little bit, and I'm going to take my player character. Now I have this main camera. I'm going to delete that main camera because my camera that I want to use is going to be my first person controller. So there's my camera there, and that one's set the main camera. So again, we don't want to have both of those set. So I'm just going to take this guy, and we can see what direction he's looking. I'm just going to move him back a little bit. Okay, so now when I hit play, okay, we can walk. Now this sphere is actually, I'm like colliding over top of it. Let's make it a little bit bigger so we definitely can really see that. So I'll just go 3 by 3 all the way around there. And that should be much bigger. Okay, good. So now I can't walk through it, okay? So that's important. And that's because we have this sphere collider on here. So this is a collider object. and it is currently not set to a trigger. Now, if I check is trigger and I hit play, I can walk right through the object. So it has a collision detection on it, but it is only detecting this trigger setup. Material, this would be a physics material. So this would be like if I wanted to make it bouncy or have a lot of friction or be icy, something like that. But we don't need to worry about that for this object because this object is just a trigger. We don't collide with it that way. We have our radius, so this is the we have the center position of our collider, so we can see what the collider looks like there. Now, we want our collider to be exactly where it is. Under the radius, I could make the radius bigger than my actual object, but then my trigger is going to happen before I get to the object. So we're just going to leave it at 0.5, which means it's going to be the size of the object. So we can see that it is indeed the same size as our object. And then we have our mesh renderer, which again, this with the mesh filter just allows us to see the object, and you can see our material under here, matte trigger. Okay, so that's our trigger object, but currently when I walk into it, nothing happens. Well, that's because there's no script on this to read out any information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that script. Now, I'm going to be doing the scripting in MonoDevelop. Visual Studio works really nicely. I like Visual Studio, but since MonoDevelop is installed when you install Unity, I'm going to use that because that'll be easiest for most people to work with. So I'm going to go into my scripts folder, and I'll create a C# script. And you can use JavaScript, but everything I'm writing is going to be in C#. So you want to make sure if you're following along with this, you're using the same programming language. If you know JavaScript and C#, pick whichever one you like best. So we'll go ahead and name this script. I'm just going to call this trigger. And we'll double click that to open it up in MonoDevelop. Oh, see, I have Visual Studio as my default because that's what I typically use. And I'll show you guys how we can change that. So if you want to change that setting so you don't have it open up in Visual Studio, you can just come over to Edit, Preferences, and go to External Tools. And right here where it says External Script Editor, I'm just going to switch this to MonoDevelop. And it should make the switch over there. And then I can just close that. So now when I double click on it, it should open up in MonoDevelop. I've got this zoomed in nice and big so it's easy to see what I'm writing. We'll just click OK here on this warning that we're getting. You'll see that a lot in Unity or in MonoDevelop. You can just hit OK on that any day now. Okay, well, it doesn't want to go away, so we'll just skip that. I don't know what it's doing. All right, so in order to do this, when we open this up, we're going to have our public class called trigger. This is going to be the same file name as our what we named it in Unity. So if I just Alt-Tab over, we can see that name there. And we're going to create some different functions here. So the functions we're going to use, we're going to get rid of start and update because we don't need those currently. And so what I'm going to use is, and we start off by typing void. And so I'm going to do an on trigger enter. And anytime we write a function like this, we're going to use a open close parentheses or left and right parentheses, whatever you want to call it. And we're going to have our curly braces. So everything that's going to happen in this function happens in here in between. But what we need to do is we need to feed in some information here into the parentheses. So what this function is looking for is it's looking for a collider. So I can type in collider. We'll see it there pop up. And we're going to give this collider, any collision that comes in here, we're going to label it as a name. So I'm going to call it collider other. So this is whatever other object. So it's not the object itself, it's checking the collision of another object coming into it. So anything that comes in will be labeled as other, and then we can check out things about what those other objects are. So on trigger enter only happens the frame that we enter the trigger itself. So I'm going to write a debug message here just to let us know that when we enter this, we'll get this message. So I'm going to say debug dot log, and we're going to do left and right parentheses, and I always end with a semicolon there so we know that that's already done. We always want to have our semicolon in there. And debug log is looking for a string type of information. So I'm going to just put in my two quotations, and I'm going to type in here an object entered the trigger. I like exclamation points. It makes it more exciting when I'm playing the game. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this as is. So we'll just go up to File, Save, and save that. Now we'll hop back over to Unity. And this is going to take a second. It should update. We'll see the update happen down in the corner here. And if we got any errors, they would pop up in the console here. Now, I have my console set up to collapse all errors, so any like errors will be kind of put together. And so that's why I have it that way. It makes it easier to kind of see certain things. But I need to apply this. So typically when I start writing a new script, I go ahead and apply it to whatever object it's going to go to, and then I write the script. That way it's already applied and I don't forget to apply it. And I didn't do it in this case, but I wanted to make a point to mention that. So I'm going to take that trigger and I'm going to apply it, or the trigger script, and apply it to my trigger object. So now we're going to see we have a new component here called trigger script. And currently there's really nothing here. It doesn't really say anything. It doesn't give us any information to change. If I go to the console window and I hit play, okay, actually, let's get out of full screen mode just so we can see. So I'm going to go over to the game tab here and just turn off maximize on play. That way it's easier to see what's going on. So I still have my object there. Okay, so now I enter, and as soon as my character enters, I get a message that says an object entered the trigger. Okay, so our trigger functions. That's good. But notice that it's only happened one time. So it only happens basically any time we enter. So if I walk back and I walk in, and I turn around and walk out, I still only have one debug message there. If I walk in again, it happens again every time I walk in. Now it doesn't matter if I stay in the object or exit the object. It's just the fact that I've entered it. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and clear our messages there. All right, so we have this, but what if an enemy walks in, or what if an item or something or a box falls over and it lands there? All those objects could have collision on them, so anything that has collision can be read in here. We also have some different functions. I'm going to just copy this just to make this easier. So Control C, I'll press enter there, and I want to show one of the other functions. So we also have on trigger exit. Same idea, we're going to use a collider. We're going to label it as other. And in my debug message, I'm going to say an object exited the trigger. So I'll go up and save, and go back over to Unity, wait for my script to update. Okay. And now I'll walk into my sphere again. And so now when I step in, I get one message, and when I exit, I get another message that says an object exited the trigger. And every time I enter or exit, I'm going to get that. And we have one more on trigger function that we can use. So I'll go ahead and copy that one. And this one's going to be a little bit different. This one's going to be on trigger stay. And again, we're using exactly the same thing here. In this case, I'm going to say an object is currently in the trigger. So what happens here is this one's going to run as long as something is in the trigger. So save that. Wait for it to update again. There we go. And so now we're going to get 3 messages, but one of them is going to continuously count every single frame that I'm inside of the trigger. So I get my enter and exit. And hold on a second. On trigger exit, on trigger stay. Oh, I never exited, right, okay. Oh, good, that finally let me get rid of it. That was annoying me. I didn't exit, that's why I didn't get my 3rd message. I was expecting 3 there. So I get one when I go in. I get all of these other messages that are counting up as I'm inside of it. And when I exit, I get my other one. So that's all great. But like I said, let's say we have different objects coming in there. So let's say I make another object. But in this case, actually, let's just do this. Let's create another object. So I'm just going to create a, I'll create a cylinder, and that's at 0, good. And I'm going to take that object and I'm going to parent it to my camera here. So I'll go back to my scene and I'll move this out in front here. I'm going to scale this down a little bit. 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. Okay, so that object is parented and it has a capsule collider. So now, if I have that object and I look around, so I'm kind of holding this can out in front of me, as soon as the can goes in, it triggers the object. Well, that's not very specific. What if I only want to check to see if the player goes in? So what I can do is, I'm going to add a tag, and I'll call this can. Seems like a weird, let's go item, just so it's a little more general. And I'm going to take my cylinder object, and I'll tag it as item. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my script here. So I'm going to say in my debug, I'm going to add an if statement first to check whether or not this is our player or this is a can object. So I'm going to say if, we have our open and close parentheses and our curly braces. Okay, so I have my if statement here. So what I want to do is I want to check if the other object that is coming in is tagged as one thing or another and what to do in those situations. So I'm going to say if other dot compare tag. So we can see that down here. We put our dot there just to bring up the different attributes of other. So compare tag. And compare tag is going to have a left and right parentheses as well. And it is going to be looking for a string. So in this case, I want to type in exactly what my tag is. So I have one that's player. And I'm going to do a copy and paste this down below. And I'll have another one that's just called item. And so in this case, I'm going to take my debug message here and cut it and paste it. So this one is going to say the player entered. The player entered the trigger. And in the other one, so this would be like the case of something else going into the trigger that I don't want. So this one will be an item. An item entered the trigger. And I can go ahead and copy and paste this down below here. I'll paste it here as well. And so what I'll do is on trigger exit, I can say the player exited. and an item exited. And then I can do the player is currently in. And then an item, let's copy and paste that so we don't have to keep rewriting things, is currently in the trigger. Okay, so we'll save that. So in this case, if I play, I have my console window there. Okay, so I have my can. So it says an item entered the trigger. An item is currently in the trigger. And I enter, and it says the player entered the trigger. The player is currently in the trigger. If I step out, I get the player exited the trigger. And if I pull the can out, an item exited the trigger. So from there, you can do a bunch of different things. I'm not going to cover everything. I just kind of wanted to show how do we set up triggers in order to have different things happen. Now, we can do many different things. I can say if compare tag is player, I could kill the player. Maybe it's a hazard or something like that. Or I could simply do something like, let's say I wanted to just destroy the item when it goes in. So I could just simply have on here, if other compare tag is item, I can say destroy. And I'll say left and right parentheses, semicolon. And this is going to be looking for an object. And I'm going to say other dot game object. And so that'll take whatever this other object is. If it is an item, it'll destroy that other item, not our player. So it'll do that on enter. So I'll save that. Okay, I hit Control S to save that time, which is typically what I would do. And now we'll play. And when we enter, the can should be destroyed, and it'll disappear from our hierarchy list there. And there we go. The object disappeared. It was destroyed. So if our player had health, we could make it to where it takes down the player health. We could add to a score. There's many different things you can do with this, but the main part of the tutorial was setting up these triggers so that they function. So just in review, we want to make sure is triggered is checked, and we want to make sure that the object that is going in has some sort of collision. Now, if we're using a character controller, they will, because that is a type of collision. And we want to tag objects if we want the trigger to know the difference between different objects. And just one more look at the code that I can kind of show. We have on trigger enter, on trigger exit, on trigger stay. And that's going to conclude this tutorial. So if you like this tutorial and you found it helpful, please give me a like. Share it with people that you think this might be helpful for them. And thanks for watching.